In. Open up your Bibles, if you would, to 1 Samuel chapter 30. If you're still learning your way around the Bible, know this, that the Bible's divided into two categories. This may be a whole new thing for you. It's divided into two categories, the Old Testament and the New Testament. The Old Testament starts with Genesis. It's before the birth of Jesus. And the New Testament starts with Matthew. It's from the birth of Jesus on. And 1 Samuel is in the Old Testament. It's like the ninth book of the Old Testament. So it's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1 Samuel, okay? If you get to 2 Samuel, you've gone too far. So anyway, 1 Samuel chapter 30. If you've been here the last couple of weeks for the first time, let me say this, that last week and this week is a little unique. It's not typically how we do things. That we usually talk in series that take, 3, 4, 5 weeks. And we're going to start a new series next week. But last week we wanted to end up the year to kind of prepare us for this year. And then I believe that God gives us a word as a church to embrace. And so I like to kick off the year talking about that. And that's what we're going to do. And so this is about who we are as a church, but maybe it's about who you are. I believe that there'll be some things in your own life personally that it will speak to you as well. And so I believe that the word that he's given to us this year as a church is pursue. And we'll talk about how that fits with us as a church. Some of it's kind of obvious, I believe, or pretty obvious with what we're doing with the facility. But just in other things, just even more clarity of vision, clarity of purpose for who we are, that we are called to make disciples. That's Jesus' mission, and we believe in that. As Christ followers, we believe in that. We want to introduce people to a real relationship with Jesus. We want to help them discover their gifts. We want to connect them to life groups, to small groups, so that they're not journeying alone. And as they discover their gifts, it helps reveal their purpose so they can serve in a ministry. And so that's what we're looking to do and to create in each one of us, because we know that's what anchors us in. So what keeps us steady. So there's different things like that. We're going to look at this. So in 1 Samuel chapter 30, we'll start with verse 1 there. And the guy that we're talking about here is King David. Now, just to give you some background, at this point, he was not recognized as king. He'd been anointed king by a prophet had anointed him king, but he's having to run from Saul because Saul is not willing to give up that position and oh, hey, I thought I was supposed to be king. Oh, here you go. He didn't do that. Matter of fact, he was so angry at David that he was trying to kill him. And it's interesting that at this point, David had found favor with this group of people called the Philistines. Now, the Philistines were like adversaries, enemies of Israel. And as a matter of fact, kind of another side thought, which to me is very fascinating, is that Goliath, the giant that David had killed, was a Philistine. So somewhere along the line, he'd gotten favor with one of the rulers of the Philistines, and they gave him a place to kind of reside and for protection in their land. Well, the Philistines were getting ready to go off to war, and they told David, hey, dude, we're letting you stay here to be safe, but we really don't trust you, so no, you can't go to war with us. And so he said, okay, so what we're picking up is he's going back to the town that they had given him because the other group's getting ready to march off. So he's going back to get with their families. Him and his men are going back to get with their wives and their kids. And so we're going to pick up there with what happened. So it says in verse 1, it says, 3 days later, when David and his men arrived home at their town of Ziklag, they found that the Amalekites had made a raid into the Negev and Ziklag. They had crushed Ziklag and burned it to the ground. So you can imagine as they're coming up on this place and they see their town, the closer they get, they can tell that something's not right. Probably since they burned it to the ground, there's hardly anything more devastating than fire, right? I mean, it's just so destructive that there's nothing to recover. So it's burned to the ground, and they see that from a distance. And then when they get closer, this is what else they notice happens. When they burn to the ground, they carried off the women and children and everyone else, but without killing anyone. When David and his men saw the ruins and realized what had happened to their families, they wept until they could weep no more. David's two wives, Ahinoam from Jezreel and Abigail, the widow of Nabal from Carmel, were among those captured. David was now in great danger because all his men were very bitter. Everybody say bitter. Bitter. About losing their sons and daughters. I imagine they miss their wives too. And so about losing their sons and daughters, and they began to talk of stoning him. But David found strength in the Lord his God. And so understand who we're talking about here. These were men that had been, that they were battle tested. They'd been hardened by the circumstances of life. And so they were probably not emotional men. And when they came back, they were so overcome and overwhelmed by the loss that they'd seen and experienced It says that they began to weep, and it says they wept until they could weep no more. That's a pretty rugged grief, isn't it? I mean, to be overwhelmed that much, and again, to be guys that, you're not crying, probably they can count on one hand the number of times that they cried as adults. And yet here they are in this moment, they wept so much they could weep no more. And as so often happens, as they were going through this, then eventually their grief turns into anger. And then when it turned into anger, then they began to talk of stoning David. They were very bitter about what had taken place. Kind of like this is your fault. This is your fault. If you hadn't done this, if we hadn't followed you, we wouldn't be here. Our wives and our kids wouldn't be gone right now. This is your fault. And so as you look at that, so many times in our own lives, whenever we feel overwhelmed or overcome with pain, it's so easy to get into a situation where we begin to place blame, isn't it? To begin to find out who's responsible for this, who did this to me? Why am I here in this situation? And to say, it's because of you, you did this, it affects the way that I see you. It has an impact on the way that I deal with you and the way that I want to treat you right now. And so David right here, he was in this situation where his men began to blame him. It says they began to talk of stoning him. But then it says this, but David found strength in the Lord his God. In other words, he could have turned and said, guys, this isn't my fault. I was just doing what God told us to do. If we're going to blame anybody, we should blame God. Right. And so I know that all of us have been there. Maybe some of you are there right now where you've experienced just some circumstances that you feel overwhelmed. And it's just so tempting to want to blame somebody for it. To blame your spouse, to blame your job, to blame your parents, to blame your kids, to blame your neighbors, to blame your church, to blame your parents. Whatever it is, that you just feel this desire to just like, this is your fault. If you'd done what you were supposed to, I wouldn't be here right now. Just that feeling to do that. And the truth of the matter is that you may be very right in some ways to think that it was their decision that made these circumstances possible or opened up the door for this opportunity. That may be true. But here's the deception, is that blame becomes an anchor. It becomes a place that we don't move away from. It becomes a place of justification to stay in our grief and to be overwhelmed by the things that we're experiencing. And so with the word for pursue, if that's a word that, I believe that's the word God's given us as a church, but if that rings in your heart, then it's a word for you to embrace as well too. And know this, that before you can pursue, that you have to lay aside blame. That whatever it is, whoever it is that you want to point the finger at, whatever circumstances, whatever situation, if that's the way we spend the rest of our life, then we are destined and doomed to stay right where we are. Now, does that mean that there aren't things that we don't need to do? Does that mean there aren't conversations we don't need to have? Does that mean that there aren't decisions that don't need to be made? That's not what I'm saying at all. But what I'm talking about is blame that just paralyzes us. That it just justifies our pain, and it doesn't create any movement out of us. Because the truth of the matter is that one of the beauties of pain is that when we don't spend all of our time blaming people, then sometimes pain is one of those things that God uses to push us and move us to the next thing, to reveal to us our purpose. I can't tell you how many ministries, how many times people's direction lives changed, and it was birthed in the soil of pain. But if you just stay there with that and just look for blame and don't do anything, it becomes an anchor that just levels you down there, and it weighs you into that. David was different, and it says that he found strength in the Lord his God. Number one is this, if you're taking notes. If you're going to pursue, you have to refuse to let blame anchor you. What are you doing in the middle of your circumstances? What are you doing in the middle of your disappointments? Psalm 4:8, David wrote this. I thought this was good. He said, in peace, I will lie down and sleep, for you alone. Everybody say you alone. You alone. In other words, he realized that he as much as these guys, he loved them, that his peace was not found in them, because he saw just like that they could turn against him. Just like that they wouldn't be for him. He said, I will lie down and sleep in peace. He said, in peace I will lie down and sleep, for you alone, O Lord, will keep me safe. That the only one that he could count on all the time was the Lord. But that didn't mean he was going to, and we'll talk about this in a minute, that didn't mean that forever he was going to keep people out, because you just can't trust people. That's not what he said. He just realized that the one constant in his life was God, because sometimes in our pain, in our disappointment, we want to look for somebody to say, who's responsible for this? It hurts too much just to let it go. Somebody has to be responsible. And so that's where his men were, and that if they would have just stayed there, they would have never recovered their wives. They would have never recovered their kids. They would have never rebuilt and restored the things that God had for them. And we're no different. I know as I talk about this, maybe 2019 was a horrible year for you. Maybe there was loss you experienced. Maybe there was change. Maybe things were done to you. And maybe still are. Maybe people have talked about you, said things, and it's just you. So, I mean, it's created this pain in your life, and so it's just real easy just to say it's their fault. And as long as your focus is completely on that, as opposed to how do we bring about change in this, then you'll never see change. Blame just becomes too comfortable. It becomes your easy chair, the place that you feel justified to sit at. So number one is this: if we're going to pursue as a church, and if God has called you to pursue certain things, then you can't get comfortable with blame. You have to begin to move. We'll talk about that here in just a moment. But it's just one of those things that we just can't just sit here and just in our grief and not do anything with it. Not move, but we have to take a step. We have to go. We have to begin to pursue, and that requires us to get up from our finger pointing and move forward. And so number one is this: refuse to let blame anchor you. Let's keep reading. He said, as they began to talk of stoning him, but David found strength in the Lord his God. Then he said to Abiathar the priest, bring me the ephod. So Abiathar brought it. Then David asked the Lord. David asked the Lord, should I? He asked the Lord, should I? Should I chase after this band of raiders? Will I catch them? And the Lord said to him, yes, go after them. You will surely recover everything that was taken from you. So in the middle of their grief, in the middle of their real pain, it wasn't made up. It was legitimate. It was heart-wrenching. It was destructive. That in the middle of that, he began to seek God's direction. God, what do you want me to do? What do you want me to do? I mean, these guys are blaming me, and I could really blame the guys that took them, but I want to know what you want me to do. And one of the things that happens whenever we talk about pursuing is to understand this, that we're not just pursuing just anything, but we want to pursue what God has called us to pursue. And sometimes the answer seems obvious, and sometimes, like in this situation, to me the answer seemed obvious, like, yes, go get them. But David's walk with God was such that he was like, I want to know what the Lord wants me to do. And so he began to seek the direction of the Lord, and he began to seek the timing of the Lord. And both those things matter. Both those things are significant. To know what do you want me to do in this situation? I want to do what you want me to do. If I'm going to pursue, I want to pursue down the path that you've called me to go. And I believe you've called me to pursue some things, to bring about change, to pursue some things, to move towards what you have for me, what you, like in the church, what you have for us as a church. And so what direction do you want us to go? And when do you want us to do it? Now, I will tell you that for me, the older I've gotten, that a lot of times recognizing what the Lord wants me to do becomes easier. The thing I still struggle with the most is the timing on it. Because, I want to do it now, like today. And that's only because I wanted to do it yesterday and we didn't make it happen. I want to do it today. And so many times there's still things that need to be done. There's still a work that God's doing. There's a preparation that he's doing in me. That's why sometimes things take longer. It's because there's things that are taking place on the inside of us. There's a work that's being done there. I've shared with you this often, the story of who we are as a church, and that in my own life, in my own personal story, that even though I'm from here, most of you know this, but a few of you may not, that for 17 years, me and Tina and our kids, we lived in New Mexico, and all three of our kids were born there, so it'll be a part of our story forever. And there was a time that I thought we would live there forever. But as time went on, my heart always felt a pull here to this place, to Oklahoma. It's just, I love this place, and I love Northeast Oklahoma. I love this area. And so I remember in 2003, I kind of had it settled in my heart. That's what I was supposed to do. And yet as I'm getting ready to kind of make plans to do that, there were kind of the brakes that were put on some things that had taken place. And I felt like God was dealing with me like, the time's not yet. And man, that was frustrating. Because I was like, man, the time's not yet. I mean, it should have happened like 5 years ago. And now you're telling me that 5 years later, the time's not yet. And so many times, that's where we mess up. One of the things that I challenge people to do, follow me on Facebook, I've done it the last couple of years, is that to start off the year with a really big prayer. I call it your big ask. Your big ask. And so, I'm not going to say that. Anyway, so you got to be careful how you say that. So anyway, I said that first service, and I promised I wouldn't do it second service. Lord, I'm so sorry. I'm addicted. Okay. So anyway, but anyway, to pray a big prayer, and just one of those things that the magnitude of it honors God. That it's such a big request that it honors Him and His greatness. And I know sometimes we pray and it doesn't happen immediately, then we get discouraged and think, well, I can't pray that way again. I think about this. Abraham waited 25 years for his big prayer to be answered. And sometimes there's a work that God's doing in us before we can experience what it has for us. And He won't sacrifice that work in us for what He has for us. This happens first. This happens first. What takes place behind the scenes is essential. What takes place internally is essential to prepare us for what will happen publicly. It's preparation that He does. And so as we pray to be able to ask Him these things, what it is that He wants for us. This is that David asked the Lord. He asked the Lord, should I do this? Is this what you want me? Is this the path you would have me go? And then once we have that settled to say, is the time now? This is when I go and the Lord told him, said, go after them. You can almost sense this urgency. Go after them. And so for us, that one of the things that happens whenever we begin to pursue is we've got to make sure that we're pursuing what God wants us to do. Let me tell you the challenge in my own life. And I wish I could tell you that I'm past this, but I still struggle with this. Not the challenge, just one of the challenges. I've got a list of them. But anyway, here's one of the challenges, is that so many times I come up with my own plan and I say, God bless it. Right. And the best thing to do is come up with His plan and it's already blessed. Come on now. And so that's what we have to do, is not take my plan to Him and say, bless my plan, but to say, Lord, what's your plan? And then when we get His plan, it's already blessed because it's His. And so we have to understand that we have to seek God's direction. Lord, I pursue. I'm made to pursue. I don't want to get stuck here. What is it you want me to do? What's the next thing? And to just trust His direction, His revealing. And then, Lord, when do you want me to do this? What's the timing for this? When is this going to happen? So number 2 is seek God's direction and timing. Now, I think it's interesting that we know that there were at least 600 men with David, and I'll tell you how we know that here in just a minute. We'll read that in just a minute. But there were at least 600 men with them, and all of them were talking about killing him. All of them were talking about stoning him, and he even had a priest among them. Now, we don't know if the priest joined in and goes, yeah, let's kill this guy. But we do know this, that we don't have any mention of the priest saying, hey, let's seek God. And so whenever David said, bring me the ephod, that was what they used whenever they were getting ready to seek God. It was something that God had given them to bring out and to begin to pray. And they used it kind of as a point of contact for seeking God's direction. Well, nobody had done that. Isn't it wild that in this moment of destruction, in this moment of disappointment, and probably the most challenging moment that they'd experienced as a group together, that nobody stopped and said, maybe we should seek God about what we're supposed to do. And it's because they were so connected to blame, they were in so much pain, that nobody was able to step away from that and say, our help comes from the Lord. But David did. I look at different people throughout the Bible, and even in times in my own life, we think about, when we get in trouble, who do we go to? Where do we go for direction? Where do we look at, and I would, one of the things that is huge is godly counsel. But don't separate those words. It's not just counsel, it's godly counsel. To get godly counsel to do that, and then also to see God. It's interesting, Saul, who was the king at that time, was so backslidden that whenever he got in trouble, he sought a witch's counsel. Which God's clearly like, don't do that. And then different people go different places, but David, the thing that caused him to stand out and be distinguished was not the fact that he didn't experience pain like this. He lost his wives and kids too. And just because we know God's plan and his direction doesn't mean it's going to be painless. If you're new in your walk, if you've just become a Jesus follower just recently, let me tell you and encourage you to know this. Just because you're a Christian now doesn't mean that life will always be easy. It doesn't mean that you won't encounter things along the way that are incredibly painful. Here's a great picture. Here's a great moment that we get to see that happen. Later on, one of his sons rebelled against him, caused great pain in his life. So none of us are exempt, right? But the truth of the matter is the thing that separates us is not that we don't experience hardship, but we know who to turn to when hardship comes. And so we do that. We turn and we get direction. And we find out, what is it you want me, which path do you want me to take, and when do you want me to do that? And so number 2 is this, is that to seek God's direction and timing. Seek what it is that he wants you to do. When you have people all around you going through the same things you are, but where do they go for direction? Where do you go? And you may be the person that has to say, let's talk to God about this. Let's see what he has to say. So number 2 is seek God's direction and timing. Let's finish up with number 3 here, and let's continue reading. So the Lord told him, yes, go after them. You will surely recover everything that was taken from you. So David and his 600 men set out, and they came to the brook Besor, but 200 of the men were too exhausted to cross the brook. So David continued, everybody say continued. Continued the pursuit with 400 men. So we see here with David that he realized that he didn't want to do this on his own. And it would have been a great opportunity. Do you consider this, that the people that went with him were the very same people that a day or two before that were talking about killing him? I mean, I don't know about you, but that'd almost be a disqualification on the application, you know? Hey, I want to promote you, but have you ever thought about killing me before? Well, yeah, actually I have. You know, we'll get back with you. You know what I mean? That's, you know, hey, it's like, hey, how come you didn't promote him? Well, he's thought about killing me several times. I thought it'd be a bad move. And so, but I mean, David right here, he understood this, that so many times in our disappointment and that type of thing, that the pain is so great that we don't know what to do. We're just looking for help. I wrote this down, and I've got to embrace this too, because sometimes I don't. So I'm going to speak this for all of us. I put this down, that don't write people off in their disappointment. Encourage them and share purpose. Don't write them off in their disappointment. You may be their only lifeline, their only hope to turn them towards Jesus. And so right here, David had that. And so he realized he couldn't do this alone, and he journeyed with people that were willing to go with him. And some that at times had been disappointed in him. At times that he'd been disappointed. Some that he'd experienced pain as a result of some things that they'd said or done. But he was willing to understand the moment they were in and said, let's go together. And then along the way, 2 of them quit. They stopped at the brook and they stayed back by the stuff, and he didn't try to persuade them to go. He didn't sit there and go, well, if you guys aren't going, I'm not going anywhere. He knew what his purpose was, and he continued on with those that were willing to journey with him. And to understand this, that sometimes the people that start out with us don't finish with us. So true. And that doesn't mean they're bad. It means sometimes their part in our story is done. And I've shared this before. Sometimes, man, there's a grief that comes in me whenever that happens. But just sometimes there's a next for them, and it's not the direction I'm going in. So they went, him and these 400 people that was like, we're still going to go. Here's the cool thing about it, if you continue reading this, after they'd done that, after they'd recovered their wives, their kids, their riches and all that kind of stuff and came back, those guys were there and they were rested. They were in a good place mentally, and they're like, we're ready to hook back up with you. And some of the guys said, no way. And David's like, we're not going to do that. And so they reconnected with them again because they were ready to rejoin the mission that God had given them. If you're here, you'll hear me say this over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. You weren't made to do this alone. You were made to do this alone. And the reason why the devil tries to get us hurt and offended and get in unforgiveness is because he'll convince us that the safe place is to pull ourselves back and to isolate ourselves and go into our own personal cave where nobody has access to because we feel like it's safe, and it limits us. If you're going to pursue, who's going with you? I look at when we started 13 years ago. And it was so wild. I'll tell you that, this may sound weird to you, but I'm going to tell it anyway. I mean, if I haven't weirded you out by now, I'm in good shape. So here's the thing, is that, you know, when we started out 13 years ago, and as you know, we started the church, it was one of those things that I'd share with you a few minutes ago, that 2003, I thought this is the time, some things happened. and it just wasn't the time. And so at the end of 2005, I was like, okay, and so I went and talked to the guy that I was working for, my pastor. He's my friend still to this day, and I still view him as my personal pastor. And so I talked to him, and he felt like the timing was good. It was good for us, good for the church. And I said, you've been good to us, so we're going to help you find our replacement. And so we stayed for the next 8 or 9 months, and just before we left, he and his wife sat down and talked with us. And they said, look, we're just grateful to you. We believe in you. And so they said, we're going to pay your salary for the first year that you're there. And I was like, who am I to tell you not to? And so, it was don't let me discourage you. So it was, and so, it was just one of those things. They were just good to us. And the next year they paid 75% of it, and the next year they paid 50% of it. It put us years ahead of where we would be as a church. It did at least 5 years, I think. And so when we got here, there's some people that moved here with us. When I say they moved here, I got to clarify this. They didn't live with us. We didn't set up a compound, because I know that first when we'd say, people were like, so do they have jobs? I mean, that's what people would. So they had their own places they worked. They just were in a place of transition. I know Aaron and Rachel Kettling who go here. I think Billy and Andrea Chapman, they may be in the service, whatever. They were part of it. Just several people. And so we believe God had called us. And so my uncle, who goes to the first service, he's 89. He's going to be 90 in a few months. He drives from Tulsa. It's just incredible. I mean, I don't want to ride with him, but it's an incredible thing that he gets here. And so when he called me one day and he said, hey, there's a guy named Tom Thompson that is, they've got a group that's meeting at this place, and they're without a pastor, and they're kind of seeking God's direction. And many of you heard me share this story before. I had no interest in that. It was like one of those things, I don't know who these people are. I don't want to fight with them. I'm here with people I like, and we're going to have. But I know my uncle, that if I didn't call up Tom, that 1,000 years from now I'd be in heaven, and he'd still be asking me, have you talked with Tom yet? And so I'm like, I don't want to spend every day in heaven answering that question. And so I called Tom, set up the appointment and that kind of thing. We met with him, and it was exactly, I was so surprised. It was what God wanted us to do. He had a place for us. It ended up being this place. There were people that were here that were able to connect with us and join and do things with us. And so all of those things began to take place. And had it happened in 2003, they wouldn't have been ready. This place wouldn't have been ready. Maybe the church in Clovis would not have been in a place to do for us what they did. And what seemed like a disadvantage was perfect, because it was the timing of God. And sometimes, man, my anxiety, our pressure, our disappointment, our grief is like, why hasn't it happened yet? Because everything that God has for you, when it happens at the right time, it'll be just right. Doesn't mean without pain, doesn't mean without trouble, but things will be ready. It'll be just right for you. And so I thought about this morning, and this is just the way I think. And so that when we first started, I parked, kind of in the middle of the center and that type of thing. But periodically I keep moving. It's kind of an act of faith for me that I move further and further away, saying the church is going to continue to grow till we reach people. And so this morning was the first time I parked at the very end of the parking lot. Because I believe that this year is the year that we fill. And so I'm excited about that. Yeah, man, it's what... I'm going to get a sign that says reserved for pastors parking. It's going to be way out there. And so, and there's not anything wrong with people that do that. But anyway, but it's just an act, for me, it's an act of faith that's like, I really believe this, that we're going to need these spaces. So that's why I'm doing this, is that it's what we do, because God has called us to pursue. He's called us to pursue people that don't have a relationship with him, or those that one time walked very closely with him and have been wounded in some form or fashion. Amen. And sometimes when I say that, the challenge is that even though it's been unintentional, we've wounded people before. Man, if that's you, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. It wasn't intentional. It wasn't purposeful. I want you to be okay. I want this to be the best year you've ever had. And so don't let any of my immaturity, as unintentional as it would be, it's like if somebody hit you with a car and it was on an accident, your leg's not any less broken. Right. Don't let that hold you back. Just receive my apology. Walk in forgiveness and see what God does with it. Let's do that with each other. So the third thing is, we're going to pursue, know this, don't pursue alone. Know that God has not called you to do this by yourself. It's never the way he intended it. And that's why the enemy tries to disrupt relationships, why he tries to get us to forgive, to not forgive, to get in bitterness and that type of thing. These guys were bitter. And David could have nourished and fostered that bitterness and said, who needs you guys anyway? But he went back to them and said, God's called us to pursue them. You know, let's not blame each other. Let's get them back. Let's get them back. So he gave them purpose. And so we're called to pursue as a church. We're called to pursue people that have no relationship with God, those that have been disappointed. We're called to pursue and be relentlessly good to our community. That's who we're going to be. We're called to pursue. And so the things that have yet to come are going to change who we are. They're just going to be tools that give us the opportunity to do what God has called us to do even better. And so that's what we're going to do, is who God has called us to be. And I hope that if God speaks to you, if this is your year to pursue, that you'll step aside from blaming and begin to move forward to what he's called you to do. And that if he's called you to pursue as well, then in all of that, that you'll begin to seek the Lord for direction and for purpose. And then you don't try to endeavor to do this alone because you don't need anybody. Don't buy into that lie. Alex Haley, the writer of Roots, he used to have a picture in his office, and it was a picture of a turtle on a fence post. And somebody said, why do you have that? He said, because I'm the turtle. It didn't get there by itself. And that's the way God has called us to be, not to journey alone. So David took these 600 guys that just a few days earlier had been talked of getting rid of him. And he's like, let's not do this. Let's go together and make a change and pursue. I want you to do this. I want you to bow your heads and close your eyes for just a minute. First of all, again, as we start out 2020, if 19 has been one of those years for you, again, just do your best to leave whatever you can there. And then for any of you right now that are just experiencing disappointment or pain or anything, to just take this moment, that instead of just sitting, just kind of crumpled up in a blame that's paralyzed you. Because when I talk about this, it's not like we don't recognize challenges, because those things, again, spur us forward. But if it's not creating any action, it's just caused you to just kind of sit in one place and almost become bitter. Stop. Stop. Find your strength in the Lord. Don't find your identity in people's mistakes or their brokenness or their immaturity. Find your strength in the Lord. So let God speak to you about what he wants you to pursue this year. In your life, in your relationships. Seek his direction, what path he wants you to take, and the timing of it. And the truth of the matter is that there may be people that are part of your story that aren't as significant a part by this time next year. And that's okay. Let's just spend a moment with God. Let him speak to you. Let him give you God thoughts and do in you what he wants to do.